lead to loss of life. Over the past decade, the cost of recovering from disasters has ballooned. The average number of billion-dollar disasters doubled between 1980 and 2016. Governments all have a vested interest in reducing the costs and impacts of disasters and are or should be taking a hard look at mitigation strategies that will reduce the environmental and fiscal impacts of disasters and help communities recover faster. The safeguarding and proper spending and accounting of public resources becomes paramount during such times. Now, public resources means the money, time, property, facilities, equipment and supplies of the executive branch of state government. Public resources also means the natural resources of the state, including air, water, soil, minerals, vegetation, fish and wildlife. Now, to put this in a Zimbabwean context, under Zimbabwean law, the Zimbabwe Treasury shall manage the Consolidated Revenue Fund, determine the manner in which public resources shall be accounted for, and exercise a general direction and control over public resources. Joining us on the National Pulse today to discuss safeguarding public resources in disaster response and management, we are joined in the studio by Janet Joe, Executive Director of the Zimbabwe Coalition on Debt and Development, ZIMCOD, Dr. P.G. Kadenge, Economics Department at the University of Zimbabwe, and joining us during the show, we will be speaking to Honorable Pulu, MP for Nkulemane and member of the Parliamentary Legal Committee, and Nyaradzai Gumbodzvanda, Board Chairperson, Action Aid International. Now, if you have any views or comments on our show today, please contact us via our Facebook page, Zim Papers TV Network, or via our Twitter handle at ZTN News. Welcome to the National Pulse.
Thank you very much, Andy, for
Now,
having us.
Janet, what is your assessment of Zimbabwe's response in the mobilization, utilization, and management of COVID-19 resources?
Thank you very much, Andy. I think it has been a long road, actually. It feels like it's been a year since we have been in this crisis. And as ZIMCOD, we've been following on the use of public resources. So we have been tracking resources. And I'm glad, firstly, to say that Zimbabwe has got a legal framework that is so grounded in the Constitution. We have the Public Finance Management Act and all the other acts, even the disaster management policy we do have in place. But there have been gaps in terms of really disclosing on the utilization of the COVID-19 resources received to date. The government has produced a matrix in terms of donations received twice, the Ministry of Finance. And from the civil society perspective, we've been following on the resources every week, and we've been producing a resource tracker. And like I said off air, in terms of what we thought would be enough to respond to the crisis, covering the different priorities that we put in place, like testing, PPEs, social safety nets, additional health workers and the like, we had estimated that Zimbabwe needs about 388 million United States dollars. And according to our tracking, this has been received or pledged to the government of Zimbabwe. But we, like I indicated, this is the one facet of the matter. We have to go to the utilization then. So it is not enough to just know what we have received or what has been pledged, but where it has been allocated to. So I think this is where we are continuously engaging with the government and pressurizing, so to speak, in courts, that they also release in terms of where it has been allocated to, because we continue to hear a number of concerns from the citizens in terms of, for example, those that were earmarked to receive the social safety nets for those who lost their incomes. Most haven't received as we speak. The testing, I think there was an outcry when the responsibility or the obligation was put on the employer when we went on level 2. There was an outcry because the government has been receiving resources as well, including test kits, for example, in terms of testing the citizens. So there was an outcry in terms of, so where is it? Outcry when the wearing of masks was made mandatory. We know that as a government, Zimbabwe received quite a number of those. So there is always, I think, issues and concerns from the citizens in terms of transparency and accountability in the allocation of the resources. I think the government has done fairly well in terms of disclosing what they have received, but they need to go a step further and make it more open and share even more in terms of how they are allocating the resources. I think the Ministry of Finance itself has also raised an alarm around public officials making the requisitions for per diems and the like. So these are some of those issues that we continue to look at and talk about. But and what we want to see is we want to reduce the risk where we come to the audit and we realize that a lot of resources were actually misused.
I think Dr. Gandeg, I mean, what Janet has said is so relevant in the sense that we need to make sure that we spend every penny that we get on this disaster response, particularly under COVID-19, on where it's supposed to go. So your comments really on how Zimbabwe is managing the resource and the optimization of it.
Thank you very much for the question. I do agree with Janet that in terms of indicating to the public what the government has received, that has been very good. But it's not quite clear in terms of when it comes to the distribution of those resources. And going by past experience, people begin to doubt that some of the resources, they begin to think that some of the resources are going to the people who are not supposed to be targeted to receive those resources. I believe that it should be possible to have like a website which would indicate what has been received and who and how it has been distributed. I think that can still be done so that there is greater transparency and accountability.
Maybe I can ask you about that, because how is Zimbabwe faring in terms of fulfilling transparency and accountability principles in public resource management? Is a disclosure of COVID-19 resources enough? I think we've spoken about that, but accountability and transparency, I think, are critical.
Yes, and I wouldn't just be focusing on the COVID issue when it comes to transparency and accountability. I think our parliament has very good committees that try to hold government to account for the use of resources. But we have observed that there's been resistance to that. If you look at the Public Accounts Committee, it has invited individuals to come and account, but deliberately those efforts have been frustrated by either a lack of quorum or the particular individuals not cooperating. So really the public doesn't have that confidence. Although we have confidence, the public has confidence in the structures, the committees, but their effectiveness is actually undermined by the way they operate and being unable to have the people that they invite coming and accounting fully.
Now, before I ask Janet to comment, you used the word deliberately. Can you please expand on that more?
Yeah, because when it comes, there was the issue of, I think there was an individual who was invited to come before the committee, wouldn't show up, and also when it came to the Grain Millers Association, there were also issues. Why I'm saying that is, it appears there's a partisan approach when it comes to this accounting for the resources, that it appears partisan interests go in the way so that members of a given committee may not show up deliberately so that the meeting doesn't go ahead.
Okay, Janet, your comment.
Yes, I think I would just take it up from, we don't want to leave things to the end, say to the audit. And in terms of transparency and accountability, I think we've spoken about the disclosure issues, but also to buttress Dr. Kadenge's point around the parliamentary role in terms of its oversight role and the committees that are in place actually to play that oversight role. During the COVID-19, I think Parliament went on recess, so that really caused a lot of problems in terms of, so who is playing the oversight role, who is ensuring that the executive is not abusing its power, so to speak. So that was a major issue, and it remains a major issue, but I'm glad that they will virtually begin parliamentary sittings. So I think we do have a framework in terms of transparency and accountability. And our constitution is also very clear in terms of the accountability bodies actually, or accountability institutions that are supposed to be overseeing the public resources that are coming in, even during disaster context like this one. But issues of transparency and accountability, I think they go beyond. They should be enforced both in times when there's no crisis, even in disasters. So we have seen quite a number of challenges as well in terms of the procurement. I think it is also caused by the mistrust that Doc has spoken about between the citizens and the government as well. So I think we still have more steps to make actually towards enhancing transparency and accountability in the procurement as well, like I've indicated. So it would be good to know, so who owns the company, who are the beneficial owners of a certain company? Yes, and all these issues. So these are the, the little very critical, though, issues that the government has to take steps towards. But I think the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee, like Doc has said, the public accounts, for example, has really been trying to do public hearings where then there's transparency and accountability. I think we have had a lot of forensic audits that have been done, public hearings that have been done where there were irregularities raised by the Office of the Auditor. You can talk of the NARA, NASA, GMB, Command Agriculture. These are all examples that we have. But in disaster management, I think as we try to respond and to be flexible, we also create gaps and loopholes. So these are the ones that we really need to think through, that principles of transparency and accountability and opening up operations of government for public debate and for public scrutiny are very important in any democracy. And if you are building a second republic, a new dispensation, it should be hinged on transparency and accountability. We should be knowing what are we procuring from where due processes done, who are the beneficial owners of each company that the government is contracting or is giving tenders, so that we don't end up having challenges of mistrust and actually the actual misuse of public resources.
Now, joining us now on the National Purse, Safeguarding Public Resources in Disaster Response and Management, is Honourable Pulu, MP from Kulumane and member of the Parliamentary Legal Committee. Honourable Pulu, welcome to the National Purse.
Thank you, Andy, and I'd like to say, good afternoon to everybody. And thank you for inviting me to such an important discussion.
It's our pleasure, sir. Now, what are the legal and institutional frameworks in place for safeguarding public resource management?
I must say from the onset that if you look at the legal and institutional framework that we have in Zimbabwe for safeguarding public resources generally, in terms of the law, and even in terms of the institutions themselves, I mean, we have provided for that. I'll give you an example. Starting point is we look at our constitution. What does it provide? Section 229 says that Parliament shall have oversight over state revenues and expenditure. We've seen that. Although in the discussion you've pointed out some of the shortcomings in as far as the effectiveness of Parliament has been during this COVID outbreak. If you look at Section 300, it limits state borrowing, it limits public debt. Section 307 deals with public expenditure. We have the Auditor General is provided for as an institution as well. We have principles of public management. I'm just picking a few. We have the Anti-Corruption Commission. We've got rules on procurement. If you look at our national objectives, transparency and accountability is scattered all over as part of the key governance, the important principles that we have. Even if you look at the public principles of public accountability, they also demand transparency and accountability. Let me just highlight some of the legislation that you might want to think about. We have the Public Finance Management Act, which really allows Parliament to then, have a look at how public funds are being spent. We have the parliamentary committees as well. We have the committee system. And you've seen the Public Accounts Committee, how active it has been in trying to interrogate some of these things. We also have Access to Information and Protection of Privacy Act, IPA. it's important, as Janet has been pointing out and everybody else has been pointing out, one of the things we don't have in all this, in terms of the COVID response, whilst we have a matrix of what has been received, we don't have a distribution matrix. And that's information that you could demand in terms of IPA. I know of an organization which has gone to court. The courts are another institution to try and get a distribution matrix. So, of course, the courts have not been sensitive. They haven't seen that this is, urgent. So whilst we have our institutions, I would suggest that our institutions need to be sensitized to this issue of public finances, specifically during this period. The Public Health Act, again, gives the minister power to mobilize resources during a time when there's this, public health or this crisis. You also have the Civil Protection Act is important. It also sets up a Civil Protection Commission, which plans, a committee which plans and budgets and can get money, and the president can give them more money. The president can even recommend that they get more than what has been budgeted by Parliament or what has been given to authorized by Parliament if it's urgent, but not beyond 10%. I could go on and on. There's just so much.
Right.
And some of it will come out as you ask me questions as we go through the program.
No problem. Now, Janet in the studio mentioned the deficit of confidence, and I think it's seen the most when you see committees holding people to account or interrogating various companies. Yet it also appears to ordinary citizens nothing gets done even after those committees are held and people are interrogated. Your comment?
Now, what happens with the various committees is that obviously, you want the committees to be effective. Once they expose certain things, then changes must follow, and accountability measures must follow. But parliamentary committees, what they do is after making the investigations, firstly they expose things that the public may not know or other government departments may not know. So one of the purposes of those hearings is that it exposes the issues. So I feel that even when someone refuses to come to a parliamentary committee, they've been exposed. But next, after the exposure, after the hearing, the committee makes recommendations to the different departments. And those recommendations, I think we need to see more firmness in following up and ensuring that the recommendations are taken on board. And one of those mechanisms is also the Wednesday, question and answer, where you can ask a minister that, have you followed up on these recommendations? Let me tell you what the biggest tragedy has been during this lockdown period. The first one is that Parliament, obviously, for obvious reasons, because of the nature of the crisis, had to shut down. But at the same time, we hadn't anticipated a situation where Parliament can work remotely. We need to fix that. But the second tragedy is that we have been consumed more by politics during this period rather than by these practical issues of trying to see how Parliament can, or a few committees, can actually be following up and demanding things like the distribution metrics during this time. So another thing that's killing the credibility of Parliament is that there is more energy spent on politicking. You've seen what has been happening, on both sides. There is too much politicking. And even the public demands politicking. They're entertained by politicking rather than demanding that members of Parliament and parliamentary committees and Parliament itself be more sensitive and spend more time delivering key deliverables. Nobody knows what the key deliverables, nobody cares what the key deliverables of Parliament are. People care more whether, member of Parliament Pulu or member of Parliament so-and-so is donating maize and doing all sorts of things which are really not part of the core mandate. And the core mandate gets neglected. I do agree 100% with what you're saying there.
Now, you did mention the distribution matrix as one gap. Are there any other gaps in this whole process and possible policy options and interventions that are required to ensure public resources are effectively and legally managed?
The biggest hurdle is our economy as well. If you go and look at the Civil Protection Act, you will see that it makes references to plans and possible budgets If you go to Section 29, it actually establishes a fund. So when we hit this crisis, we should have had a fund which is ready to deal with this. But whatever had been allocated to that fund, you and I can already see, would have been meaningless by the time that the crisis hit, because it would have been overtaken by inflation. The power, the buying power of that money would have been eroded. And you can also have advances to the fund. Objects, there must be objects of the funds which are set out. They are set out there in the Act. There must be estimates of expenditure. It talks about limits also on that. And none of that has really been implemented. So we've had to rely 100% on amounts which have been pledged and donated, and amounts which have had to come from the Minister of Finance's vote directly. And that is improper on its own. That's upside down. We should have relied on Section 29 to 36 of the Civil Protection Fund. That did not happen. That's a big gap. So it ties in with the economy. But also it means that even during the time when there is no emergency, we should be monitoring and discussing more about the readiness of the people in the Civil Protection Unit and so forth. And obviously, this act also needs to be aligned to the new constitution so that we tie up on transparency and decentralization and all other things like that. So that's one gap. The next one is that Parliament must be able to operate remotely during this time so that oversight becomes effective. So, that's another gap. We also need to enable civil society, because they're a major player as well, to be able to come in more effectively. I mean, during this shutdown, when I looked at the COVID-19 legal framework, civil society was effectively shut down, and even up to now, civil society organizations remain shut down. They haven't been exempted to come back to work. And therefore, they can't monitor. Yet the Public Health Act requires that the government should partner with them. The Constitution requires that in development and in dealing with this kind of disaster things, you must involve the community, you must partner with them. These are some of the weaknesses that are there. We should learn from them, and next time around, be able to ensure that we identify key stakeholders, work with them, identify key areas, and ensure that this readiness becomes a key discussion. How ready were we as we came into this from a financial point of view? Did our fund have any money in it, and how much did it have?
Now, do we have a specific framework for safeguarding public resources in the context? And I want to ask you another question. What legal remedies can be taken against the executive if public resources are actually misspent? Are there any lessons we can draw from previous pandemics, epidemics, and natural disasters in Zimbabwe? Cyclone Idai springs to mind.
Well, the starting point is that in terms of our principles of public funds, public finances, is that they must be handled transparently, fairly. They also must be distributed to people equally, to provinces, equitably, and so forth. And on the basis of that, I think that where you know that this is not being done, you could approach the courts to ensure that you get an order for the government to disclose how it has come to the distribution matrix that it has done, and ensure that they are compelled to cover any area where there's a deficit. For example, during this pandemic, people living with disabilities, how were they able to move around? Is there any funding that went their way? If you were looking at the whole distribution. But unfortunately, we don't have that gap. We don't have that distribution matrix. That's a gap. Our courts also need to be sensitized to the importance of this transparency. I'll tell you, there's an organization which went to court recently, and the court didn't see the urgency of having this distribution matrix. And so it means that as time goes on, we need to engage them as a stakeholder to ensure that they become truly sensitized and alive to some of these different legal provisions and how important they are. So certainly you could go to court to compel them. Right. Parliament is another one.
Right.
If Parliament was running and operational and ministers were coming to report, certainly a lot of these answers would have been provided. A lot of gaps that the executive may not have seen would have been drawn to their attention. And I think cooperation and coordination between the different stakeholders would have been better.
So therefore Parliament can call in the executive and come and ask them questions and ask them to account for what they've done and be able to hold them to that account. What legal framework can Parliament use against the executive if they don't follow what Parliament is prescribing?
Well, normally from my experience is that you will have seen before the shutdown, the ministers giving detailed, addresses in terms of any particular situation that has developed. You saw during the floods that we had, during that crisis, the ministers were addressing issues every week, regularly, because Parliament was there to summon them and ask them. And there hasn't been instances where they have refused to account to the nation about what is happening. And secondly, the committees have a power to summon people to come and testify. And, they have the power, which is almost akin to a court. And if you defy, they could actually sanction you, and you could get punished for contempt of Parliament. So the committees do have teeth. Parliament does have some teeth, although we rarely use some of those provisions to actually make sure that people take Parliament seriously. We need to start doing that more.
Right. Honourable Pulu, just in wrapping up, now the Constitution of Zimbabwe was put in place in 2013. When will Zimbabwe's laws be aligned to reflect the new framework of public resource management as defined in that same constitution?
The government has been embarking, on a process of legislating in order to align the laws to the Constitution. If you saw the legislative framework, I think it seeks to address that. And so far, a number of acts of Parliament have gone through. But with regard to public finances, the ones I can think about is the International Treaties Bill. That has gone through Parliament, but is still to be signed by the President. The Civil Protection Act is another piece of legislation that needs to be updated. That one has not come before Parliament, and we still await for it to come before Parliament so that it becomes updated. These are some of the few that I can think. The public finances legislation as well, I think is in the process of being updated. So I'm sure that before the end of this year, you will see the Public Finances Act having been updated. You will see the Civil Protection Act having been done. The local authorities, though, have not been addressed, and there's this whole aspect of devolution. Remember that if you're looking at a civil protection, one of the things you want to do is to decentralize it and make sure that in the periphery or in the local authorities or in the provinces, you also have effective response mechanisms for disaster, which are properly funded and can properly account for how they use their funds. And that will go a long way in ensuring that public funds are actually utilized effectively to deal with disasters. Some disasters are confined to a locality. You want people there and resources there to effectively deal with that, and accounting procedures to effectively deal with it. So I think that we need to ramp up in that regard to ensure that by the end of the year, at least we have those key things done. Having said so, this alignment, let's not kid ourselves, is a process that will take time. It will never take a year or two to do, because remember, the Constitution is there for the ages. But what we need to do is to prioritize some of the things we need to do urgently, and I think public accountability has not been prioritized in that regard, and that should happen.
Honourable Pulu, Member of Parliament from Kulumane and Member of Zimbabwe's Parliamentary Legal Committee. Thank you very much for participating on the National Pulse.
Thank you.
Now, unfortunately, we're going to have to take a breather now, but there's some very good points there that Honourable Pulu mentioned, which I'll bring back to our panellists in the studio. You're watching the National Pulse. Our discussion today, safeguarding public resources in disaster response and management. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimpapers TV network ZTN and our partners, the Zimbabwe Coalition on Debt and Development, ZIMCOD. In our final segment, we will be joined by Nyavadzai Gumbodzvanda, Board Chairperson, Action Aid International. Don't go away. The National Pulse will be right back. Welcome back. This is the National Pulse. Our discussion today, safeguarding public resources in disaster response and management. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Papers TV network ZTN and our partners, the Zimbabwe Coalition on Debt and Development, ZimCOD. Please keep your comments and views coming through via our Facebook page, Zim Papers TV network, and our Twitter handle at ZTN News. Now, Janet, I did ask Honorable Pulu this question. Lessons that we can draw from previous pandemics, epidemics, and national disasters. I think Cyclone Idai is fresh in our minds, and that's a great example of a disaster and how we prepared for it.
Yes, Sean. And I like the idea that you have spoken about how prepared, and the Cyclone Idai came, we were not prepared. Typhoid came, we were not prepared. Cholera has come a number of times and has always found us not prepared. So from our perspective as ZimCOD, and I think also quite a number of other civil society organizations, the issue of preparedness really cannot be an excuse in terms of protecting, fulfilling and providing for people's human rights or for the citizens' rights when we look at citizens as rights holders. If there's anything that we should learn, I think, going forward, is that these disasters and crises are here to stay. They could be climate-induced, they could be environmental issues like we are seeing now, like cholera, typhoid, and the COVID-19. We have to deal with the issues of environmental sustainability and the like. So I think going forward, having learned from the lessons of the previous disasters, we have to learn that we have to be prepared. And how do we prepare? It comes with resource allocation, which is the discussion that we are having now. So our national budgets must actually be cognizant of all these disasters and crises that we may actually succumb to as a country. They're going to keep on happening. Like I've indicated, there are environmental issues. We're talking about climate change. We're talking about contamination of water. We're talking about all these issues. So they are going to continue happening, and we have to show that we are cognizant and we allocate resources accordingly. And the allocation of resources is not only around the issue of the disaster preparedness framework, but in general, how are we doing in terms of providing social and economic rights for the people? How are we allocating resources to the health sector? How are we allocating resources to the water and sanitation, for example? How are we allocating resources to mitigate drought effects and the like, social safety nets and the like? So we have to look at it holistically in terms of how are we going to be prepared going forward, and ensuring that we put infrastructure and mechanisms that will ensure that people are able to absorb the shocks that come, or to at least be able to be cushioned from the shocks. I think we have learned that everyone has to put their hands on the deck. We all have to work, the different institutions, the different sectors of society together for us to be able to conquer these disasters and the crisis that we continue facing. I think as I conclude on this point, I just want to talk about the impunity that has been a character of previous disasters that we have faced. We have had reports where public resources were misused or abused during a crisis, and we haven't seen that coming to conclusion in terms of ensuring that there are deterrent measures and safeguards put in place. So there is this culture of impunity where public officials do not actually face the law and the sanctions that come with misuse and abuse of public resources, and see restorative kind of justice in that. How are we going to ensure that we bring back those resources back to the national fiscus so that they can benefit the citizens? I think the issue around politicization of aid is also key, and it comes with the trust deficit and confidence deficit that we have spoken about. So even now we have had, I know I have received some stories from certain areas in urban areas where people are saying, but it seems like the registration of the beneficiaries for the fund are really according to party lines. It depends with what is happening at the community level and in that particular community. But I think we have to learn around building trust, ensuring that we do not politicize aid. And I will conclude by saying that we need to build on community mechanisms for us to enhance transparency and accountability. I think there are great mechanisms from IDAI, for example, if we speak about that one. with a phone in a citizen's hand, they can actually expose a lot and create this openness that we're talking about. They can show that, okay, what you said was coming here did not come. So how are we empowering the locals to be able to play or to have a role to play in enhancing transparency and accountability as citizens, as rights holders, and as beneficiaries? And we have to build on that. And I think there is, I will conclude just by saying there's no excuse at all for our government not to refuse to be held accountable by the citizens, even in disaster frameworks.
Now, Dr. Genda, building on what Janet has said there, but also what Honourable Pulu said about the alignment of the new constitution and the existing legislative framework the government is working under, that's a huge gap, and it's a gap I think that you know people are actually, government or the executive is utilising not to fulfil some of their mandate. What would your comment be to that?
My comment would be that there's a lack of political will to actually do the alignment. Because if you look at what has happened to the Constitution, there have been a lot of amendments before the Constitution is even implemented. So my take is that it would appear that there's a lack of political will to align.
Okay, well, yes. There we go, lack of political will to align.
But I also wanted to add one thing on the economy regarding preparedness. We have a sick economy. How can a sick economy ever be prepared for disasters? I think that's where we have really a big challenge. We saw at the beginning of this crisis, the COVID pandemic, the health system was in intensive care. That's why, although government initially indicated that the country was ready for this pandemic, but when the new cases started coming through, it became apparent that even very basic equipment, facilities were not there, ventilators, sockets, you name it. So I believe that it is important to address the economy so that resources can be made available in meaningful amounts to then be prepared for disasters.
Strong economy, strong reaction.
Yes.
Now, we're now joined by Nyaradzai Gumbozvanda, Board Chairperson, Action Aid International. Nyaradzai, welcome to the National Pulse.
Hi, how are you? And thank you so much for having me on the program.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Now, Nyaradzai, are there any lessons that we can draw from previous pandemics, epidemics, and natural disasters in Zimbabwe?
Definitely. And listening to colleagues who have just been sharing, I think we have had our experiences with the drought, we have the HIV and AIDS pandemic, Cyclone Idai. I was in Manicaland last year to review one of the programs by citizens. There are a number of lessons that we have. Definitely the issue of preparedness. I feel that the issue of preparedness is not a technical issue only. It's a political issue of choice and decision-making. It's about making the appropriate decisions to put the resources where they should be, and for us to have that reserve, which enables us to have some minimum for immediately saving lives instead of when there's a crisis, we look out for international solidarity. I am sitting here in Shamva. This is a very rich district. I mean, we are selling tobacco, there is gold in this district, and yet we don't have basic PPE in the local clinics. I've just been to our quarantine center. So for me, it's a question of how do we, it's a question of government putting money where it has to be. It's just a question of choice, and that is the lesson that we learned with the drought. On HIV and AIDS, one of the lessons was let's do domestic resource mobilization. And there was the AIDS levy. It really gave us a leverage in talking to international partners, and it did give that leverage. But having the money is one thing. How it is spent is the most important.
Now, we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. There are international best practices in resource management in disaster context. Maybe you could just take us briefly through some of those.
Some of the best practices that I've seen in the work at the continental level, I was quite involved in the Ebola response. And it was very important to see at the continental level how there had to be mechanisms for information sharing and public information, also with private sector. The private sector engagement was also quite strong. And also we need that strategic relationship with civil society organizations, because when we talk about public resources, at times there is not sufficient recognition of citizens' contribution and philanthropy. And we know networks, different organizations are also putting resources, but it's not counted, it's not recognized, the whole care work, the whole contribution of volunteers, of women. So at the international level, it's clear, and we look at the guidelines that are there, whether by the UN or within civil society. We've seen it, aid effectiveness, humanitarian best standards, where there is no accountability in humanitarian response. It also means there is less support, and it means there are more people suffering. So at the end of the day, it's the person who needs to be supported who is least supported, where there is no accountability. So transparency is critical. This is why the work that ZimCOD and others are doing is so important. The other that we have learned at the international level is, unless we are very careful, humanitarian response can result in displacement of local expertise, community resources, because then there is this huge push that comes with resources and expertise from outside of the community. And at times there's not enough recognition that this community actually has people who are citizens, who have resources, who can contribute. So we need to continue to protect local innovation, local investments, just as much as we are really building on regional and international solidarity. Because at the end of the disaster, people might be left having their lives saved, but having very weak organizations. So strong civil society in communities where there is a disaster is very, very, very important. And we see local authorities. I mean, we are in lockdown in Zimbabwe, and like many other countries in the world, we need our local governments to be very active. Yes, we need the oversight of parliament at the national level, but actually we also need the elected officials in local governance to be doing the oversight. Otherwise, we are paralyzing the whole oversight mechanism. I've been disappointed that the Zimbabwean parliament started to sit very late. I understand the emergency laws, but I expected a strong early leadership of the Zimbabwean parliament. And I also expected the district level, a strong leadership of the elected officials, because that's how we do oversight. Because the issue is more than technical.
Nawadzai Gumbonzwanda, Board Chairperson, Action Aid International. Thank you very much for participating on the National Post.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Now, unfortunately, we are coming to the end of our show, but I do have two critical questions I'd like to ask you. Dr. Kadenge, from an economic perspective, why is it important that Zimbabwe's government effectively manages public resources? And I have to ask you to keep this brief.
This is very important because being effective in public resource management means you get the most out of the given resources. But if you are not effective, it means there are leakages, and so the number of beneficiaries will be much less than otherwise if there was effective management.
Thank you. And Janet, finally, and again briefly, I'm sorry for that, but in your view, the roles and responsibilities of Parliament, civil society and academia in the mobilization and safeguarding of public resources, are you, civil society, effectively exercising these roles and responsibilities? And if not, what needs to be done?
Thank you very much, Andy. I think we have really tried in terms of building both citizens' agency but individual agency to be able to hold accountable the government. And this accountability is at different levels. There's the citizens holding accountable. We have been pushing for Parliament through parliamentary portfolio committees to be able to hold accountable. But there are also other public accountability institutions, such as the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission, for example, the Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission, and the like, that we have been trying to work with and to capacitate for them to be able to play their their oversight role. So I think we have done enough given the space. The space for civil society is not that open. It's always shrinking. With COVID-19, it even shrunk worse. You had Honorable Pulu saying that civil society organizations or NGOs shut down, actually, due to COVID-19. And we have seen relaxation of the measures and the like, but there hasn't been something really spoken about the operations of NGOs and civil society organizations, so that we can be tracking and monitoring and engaging with the citizens, so that we nurture that agency that I'm talking about. But maybe just before you close, because we're talking about the policy recommendations, and I think I really had around the realignment of the laws so that they can respond to issues of prudent management of public resources. This is really, really key. And I think going forward in terms of nurturing public resource management, even in disaster frameworks, we really need a democratic, developmental oriented state going forward. How do we engage with all citizens? How do we engage with everyone to ensure that human rights are still fulfilled, are still respected, and are still protected? We need open, democratic debate and scrutiny in the use of public resources and how they're distributed. I think we have spoken about the gap between the donations matrix and the distribution matrix, and how urgent that is if we are to build that citizens and individual agency. We definitely need an activist government, if I may put it that way, that really puts people at the center when we are talking about disasters. So if we are preparing for disasters, we should be able to put the person at the center of it. How are we going to ensure that they are able to absorb, to mitigate, and to cope with the shocks that do come? And the issue of information, I think I'll just conclude on that. I think Honorable Pulu has also spoken about IPA, for example. Information that is credible, that is timely, is very important when we are talking about public resource management in disasters.
Citizen participation, citizen-centric policies. Yes. We've come to the end of our show. We'd like to thank our panelists, Janet Joe, Executive Director of the Zimbabwe Coalition on Debt and Development, ZIMCOD, Dr. P.G. Kadenge, Economics Department at the University of Zimbabwe, Honorable Pulu, MP from Kulumane and member of the Parliamentary Legal Committee in Zimbabwe, and Nyaradzai Gumbodzvanda, Board Chairperson, ActionAid International. Many thanks for appearing on the National Purse.
Thank you very much.
You've been watching the National Purse, safeguarding public resources in disaster response and management. From ZTN Studios in Harare, Zimbabwe. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimpapers TV Network ZTN and our partners, the Zimbabwe Coalition on Debt and Development, ZIMCOD. Now, should you have any comments or views on our show today, please feel free to contact us via our Facebook page, Zimpapers TV Network, or via our Twitter handle at ZTN News. Now, a final comment. There appears to be a misconception that public resources belong to the government or to well-connected individuals or companies. This perception is incorrect. Economic and natural resources such as oil, gas, metals and minerals belong to a country's citizens. The efficient and transparent utilization of these resources can lead to economic growth and social development. How any government spends and uses public resources is something that every citizen of a country must be aware of. The government is a reflection of the will of the people and a custodian of its people's needs and wants. How it spends public resources or who it allocates national resources to is of paramount importance to the welfare of all of its citizens. In a disaster context, the effective, efficient and transparent allocation of public resources becomes even more important. It must always be remembered that abuse and mismanagement of public resources not only has an immediate impact on citizens today, but also a far-reaching impact on citizens of tomorrow. Government needs to safeguard a country's resources. In fact, it is one of its primary roles, and it must be held to account by its citizens on how they do exactly that. Don't you think? I'm Andy Hodges. Goodbye, and you all be safe.